Silver Eye Society.
Welcome to the Silver Eye Society, the podcast that looks at film to find the eternal themes behind our modern issues. We're looking at the Dead Poets Society today. And the Dead Poets Society has many interesting themes, some of which we've already covered in previous episodes. But in this episode, we're going to focus on something that's an ever increasingly important issue, which is the importance of speaking truth. And what happens if you don't? That's a main theme in this movie. So, to get started with that, we're going to start with the word of the podcast.
The word of the podcast this episode is prevaricate, a verb from the 1580s. To go aside from the right course or mode of action, originally figurative, now obsolete, unlike the word of the podcast, which is never obsolete. A back formation from prevarication. We'll skip through here a little bit. So, literally, walk crookedly in Church Latin to transgress.
Church Latin?
The meaning to act or speak evasively, swerve from the truth, is from the 1630s. Now, what I found interesting about this word was this concept of to walk crookedly. Mm-hmm. How prevaricate, by the way, means to lie. Well, it means what I just said. But, you know, when we talk about prevaricating, we talk about prevarication, you know. Actually, I always thought it meant lie. Maybe it doesn't mean that. Maybe I've been surprised by my own etymology.
Oh, boy.
I mean, I thought that a prevarication, though, tends to be a lie. It's a little bit more complex. Mm. So there you are. A prevaricator is a transgressor of the law, a sense now obsolete. Don't prevaricate. Appreciate the word of the podcast. Oh, I think that's, boy. Well, look, so.
Oh, boy. Church Latin is the name of my metal band.
Well, Old Church Slavonic is the name of my metal band. It's better because I know even older, more heavy metal words.
Why did you choose this word?
Because the theme of the episode is about lies.
Yes.
That is exactly why I chose it. And also, I was a little unsure if you were going to bring out the poem of the podcast since we're dealing with this film. I knew that you wanted to change it up. You threw everybody off. You put them on the crooked path away from the study of etymology, away from the word of the podcast, into the poem of the podcast, which I accept. I think the viewers will enjoy, you know, but so I had to quickly come up with a word of the podcast on the fly, which I'm very capable of doing. So prevaricate, walk crookedly, don't do it.
That's interesting. Walk crookedly. Well, we have a lot of let's go into the scene maybe that is the best starting point to understand how the Dead Poets Society advocates for telling the truth. Now, I think the best scene for that is the one where you have Neil, which is the character that wants to be an actor. He does his play anyway, and he ends up in an altercation with his father, who still, despite seeing how much his son enjoys doing the play, demands that he follow the path he has set out for him. And he gives Neil a chance. When Neil says, "You're not listening to me," he says something like that. "You're not listening to what I want. You haven't asked me what I want." And he says, though very antagonistically, "Well, what is it? What do you want? What do you have to say?" And there's this moment there where Neil has the choice to speak his truth, to say what it is that he wants, what he believes, but he chooses to stay silent. And the result of that is death. It's a very high-stakes game, telling the truth or prevaricating. And there's another scene in this movie that also shows the stakes of speaking the truth, which is at the end, the character that has trouble speaking. I forget his name. But he's the one at the very end that stands up on his desk, and he speaks up. He's able to speak up and tell Keating that he was inspired by him, and at least sends Keating off after being, losing his job and being disgraced and all of that. Now Keating knows that he did inspire these kids and it was worth something. And so that character being able to quite literally find his voice and speak up and say what it is that he believes justifies Keating's entire effort and the suffering that he took on to make that effort. And so there's a theme throughout this entire movie of saying what you believe, but particularly of finding the voice through which you'll express what you believe. Because these are characters, they're high schoolers. So, there's the understanding here that they're still developing their personalities, their beliefs, their mode of going through the world. And there's one other character that's a good contrast to Neil, which is the kid that wants to date that girl, and he keeps pursuing her despite being turned away, despite all these different obstacles and the unlikeliness of it working out, seemingly. And because he's willing to pursue what he wants and put himself in harm's way, he actually does end up starting to go out with the girl. And so he gets what he wants by being able to take that risk and put out what he wants into the world, rather than just staying silent, standing on the wall, being a wallflower, all that. So I think this movie is a really interesting, it has a very joie de vivre about it. There's the carpe diem thing. There's this whole sense of, you pucker your face sourly to hear me use a French term.
No,
it.
It was fine.
Yeah, it was fine. But that's what it is. There's this sense of seizing the day rather than kind of playing by the stuffy rules and playing it safe. That's an element, and we spoke about that in another episode, this idea of knowing when to break the rules a little bit. And that's something that I really like this movie. This movie made me want to go out and run into a forest and look for a cave and do something slightly wrong. Not bad, just slightly wrong. Get off the grid, all that. I love that. I love that spirit of slight chaos. It's a gentle kind of chaos. It's not chaos like let's burn down a courthouse or something. Not that. I don't like that chaos. That's destructive chaos. This is exploratory chaos. It's a kind of chaos that you're just on the edge of order. Just on the edge of the institution. That's what they do, right? They go just beyond the schoolyard grounds. And in that space, that lawless space where it's just them, that chaos, I love that.
That's
my monologue.
That. Good job. Yeah. But back to lying. Right? There's another character.
Shall we get into it?
Meeks.
Is that his name?
The redheaded kid.
Oh, wow. That's so funny. That's kind of a very, snitch sounding name.
It is. I guess he doesn't lie so much as...
He does lie. He actually does lie.
Where does he lie? I forget.
So the scene, to let people know, the scene where you figure out that this character really sucks is where they're all the students are being examined basically to find that Keating is at fault for the Neil killing himself. That's basically what the institution has already decided, that they're going to put the fall on him. The parents don't care. They just want to also put the fall on him. Particularly, I think there's something very sinister in that it seems that Neil's parents are looking for someone to blame, which is super gross because it's like, damn well that that's your fault. But that the father is very much that figure of like refusing to see what's in front of him. There's something there also about the father figure in that kind of there's a kind of lying that comes from refusing to see what's in front of you. It's the same result, right? A lie is to not live in reality, but to deny what's right in front of you is also to live outside of reality, which is the same result as a lie. So what I guess that's what you say. He was living a lie. This idea that what I'm doing is good for my son. My son killed himself because of what I'm doing. I'm still doing what was good for my son. It's someone else's fault. That's to live in a lie. And so you see that this kind of destruction that comes from that. But what happens with that redhead character, I call him the narc. That character's a narc. That child is going to grow up to be a narc. So what he does is when they're doing all this cross-examining, he comes in and he says, you can get away with it. Like, what does he say exactly? I forget. Something. He says you can, look, I have it written here. Hold on. You can't save Keating, but you can save yourselves. So that's what he says. You can save yourselves. Just say that you're the victim. Because that's what he says. He's like, no, we're not in trouble. They're saying that we're the victim. So go with that. Essentially, he says, go with that. And
so
he's
lying because he knows he's not a victim. Yeah, okay,
exactly.
So I agree with that. Now, I thought that should have been handled, that situation should have been handled differently.
You wanted to put him up against the wall. Like,
no,
the other kid already punched him.
No, not exactly. I don't know if I should get into that. I'm just saying that, if you got somebody who's, let's put it this way. They're having a talk.
What should be done with this child? They're
having a discussion up in some attic or something, right? They're trying to come to a consensus about what the truth is, but how should they approach this. And so I say, look, hey, Meeks, come over here. Here for a second. Let's talk. And then you're up and you got a window there, right? And it's up fairly high above the ground. And you just open the window and you bring Meeks over there and you just kind of put your arm around him. He's your buddy, and you say, look, let's have a talk. Let's have a talk about making sure we all got our story. We want to be all making sure that we got our story straight. We want to tell the truth as a group. And we're trying to decide how to do that. And maybe he feels the wind come through the window and he notices, wow, we are really high up. And maybe he tries to take a step back and maybe you just embrace him as a friend very, very firmly and edge both of yourself up to the window a little closer. That's all. And you just say, look at this vista in front of us. Isn't it beautiful? Aren't we so lucky to have a great school and a great teacher? Don't you think that we have a great teacher, Meeks? And maybe he tries to kind of step away from the window again. You say, no, not yet. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. That's all.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just saying, it didn't even have to go to violence. I don't like
just intimidation.
Violence.
That's all.
It's a discussion. You have a discussion with people.
I can't condone tactics of group intimidation because it goes against my core belief in individual freedom. If
I agree. And at the end of the day,
consequences upon the individual for their flawed actions, then we lose the value upon the individual. But here's the thing. This is what the narc kid doesn't understand, is that he doesn't need to be thrown out of the window.
No one said he should. No one said he should, you two.
No.
I just want to make it very clear. I'm saying, why can't you have a talk next to a window?
Yes.
Okay.
Well.
And just come to a consensus.
It's just that his life will be like falling out of a window perpetually, because when you live in the lie, that's what you get. You get what you deserve. As we return again and again.
You get what you deserve. That's maybe what you say at the end of the discussion. Look, So anyway, look.
But he was sniveling. Here, let me tell you.
Was he?
What happens, right? So at the end of the movie, the kids that are inspired, that stand up, well, relatively stand up for Keating. They did kind of still let him take the fall. But they're kids, whatever. It's fine. We grant them that they are not able to, overthrow the institution yet. But they stand up on their desks in a show of solidarity with Keating. And what has to happen with the narc kid? He has to sit there, hunched over, sniveling, groveling, pathetic, and in shame. That's what happens because he thought he was going to save himself, and sure, he did, but now he lives in shame forever, or at least for the rest of those classes with he's at that school. He is tarnished by his action forever. And this is the thing, right? So we get to the core now of this topic that we're at, which is speak truth or die. So maybe you don't die a physical death.
It puts a different spin on the story I just told, doesn't it? Sorry, go on. I agree with you actually. At the end of the day, if Meeks wants to be a rat, he's got a right to be a rat.
Yes. But he's also got a right to get what's coming to him. He does get punched in the face, which I advocate for. I advocate that action upon the child, mainly because it's children fighting. And I advocate, to a degree, allowing children to fight. Okay, whatever. Sorry, I know that's very contentious, but just a little bit of, you gotta fight it out, whatever.
So you're coming along.
My own, not kids, now as an adult. I fought with people my age when I was younger. We've all scrapped up a little bit. It's good for them. Now, you don't let them bring weapons into the fight. You don't
put them in the octagon of truth. That's what I say. Throw them in the octagon of truth. Make sure that weight classes and age classes are relatively homogenized so that no one has an advantage.
Exactly.
And maybe that's how we settle our disputes now. Children fighting in cages. That's what I think we should maybe. Yeah.
I mean, they're already in the cages, right? So might as well put them all in the cages and let them fight it out. Sell tickets.
This has gone from a
it's either one or the other. We're either like, welcome to this discussion on the book Carl Jung's ideas, or we just say, make them fight, sell tickets to the children.
And I knew as soon as I brought up the idea that maybe a fictional character in a movie ought to have had a little bit of kind of mafia tactic brought into it. Look, I bring my I'm just saying, I knew that it was going to go a little bit off the rails.
Yeah.
So
let's return to the rails.
Well, briefly, I'd just like to commend you on your movement closer to me, which is where I endorse child soldiers over the last few podcasts. And it seems to me that you're moving more to my side of things step by step. You're at least endorsing violence amongst children with non-fatal weaponry. That's what the Dead Poets Society is about, ultimately.
I mean, kind of. It's anarchic children.
The weapons of truth.
Should children live in anarchy? Children are anarchy, to be honest.
They're conformist little soldiers for the most part, aren't they?
Well, these were because they're already older. But when children are younger, they stick their fingers in outlets, they eat boogers, they scream for no reason, like.
But that's just being
kind
stupid.
Of anarchism.
I don't know if that's anarchy. I think that's just being dumb, isn't it?
No, but they're like wild animals is the thing. If they were smart, but they were never civilized in society, they would be smarter. They'd be adults, but they'd still be uncivilized. They'd probably still, maybe stick their finger in outlets if they had never seen one before. If they lived in the wilderness, like a feral person.
Dead Poets Society 2. This is how the plot.
The ones that never came back. There were some that stayed
they just go back into the cave, live in the forest, and become feral people, and then seek vengeance upon Meeks and the principal.
Yeah.
Slowly over time.
They dig up the principal's grave because he would be dead by that time. Dead Poets 2020.
Well, it's not even 2020 anymore. It's 2021.
Well,
the year has flown by. It's flown by with this podcast.
In spirit, it's still 2020.
It's going to be 2020 for a long time. That's something that I said back in 2020. I said for a lot of people, it's going to be 2020 for a long time, regardless of the actual date.
It still
now,
is.
Bringing it back around to speak truth or die. What I was starting to think about beyond the idea, because it's a common philosophical debate, the morality of lying. And it's something that's actually been dealt with in philosophy for a long time. So Immanuel Kant has this thing that says, you should never lie, essentially. There's no justification for it. And then utilitarians have the idea that, well, depending on the value of the lie, actually sometimes you should because it's the greatest value. All kinds of different philosophical debates out there. I understand that. I don't really want to weigh in a great deal on the merits of each of these individual arguments for this episode. I've been reading a lot of Carl Jung lately. And strangely, you actually touched upon something without me even mentioning it, which I started to think about, which is forget about lying to other people for a second and think about lying to yourself, because he talks about this in a lot of his books, where he's saying there are truths in the unconscious that we're not capable or prepared to face at times. But if you don't integrate these elements into your conscious life, then they will come and get you. The things will rise up out of the dark. Carl Jung is really kind of a horror writer, we'll say.
Yeah.
You know? And so he'll say, well, these archetypal images and this will rise up out of the unconscious if you're not careful. And he says essentially will drive you in, not just make you neurotic, but will make you actually schizophrenic, psychotic, terrible things. So what is the value? How can you be honest with yourself, at least first, enough to navigate your own psyche?
That may be where you should start, really, because I think that when you're able to be honest with yourself, it becomes a lot harder to be dishonest with others, at least accidentally. Because I think I think the kind of dishonesty people suffer with more now in some ways is the lie by omission, which is not saying what you know to be true to avoid some kind of uncomfortable consequence. And that is a particularly pernicious kind of lie, because a lot of the time it's not just that you're abstaining from being able to hold up something that's developing. Your rebuttal to something that's developing that you disagree with slows the development of that thing. When you speak truth at something that is not truthful, it degrades the not truthful thing because it shines light on it in a way. And so if you do not do that, if you do not speak truth about something that's clearly untruthful, you don't use your ability to shine light on that thing, and it allows it to gain more power. And then there's the other pernicious side of that is that there are other people doing the same thing, and they're all doing it because they also don't see other people calling it for what it is. So it's this emperor's new clothes phenomenon in a way, which is, well, everybody else is not saying the obvious, so I won't say it either. But partially, everyone else isn't saying the obvious because everyone else isn't saying the obvious. So there's a kind of risk that must be taken when you tell the truth, because if it was easy, it wouldn't be a problem. There would be no, it probably wouldn't even be a virtue then, because I think the whole point of something being a virtue is that it requires a kind of effort. It requires some kind of strength of character to pursue it, despite there being the possibility of a negative outcome, because it's a trust that the overall outcome is still better. I think that's one thing that I saw in Socrates accepting his execution, because Socrates had plenty of chances to escape the execution. It would have been very easy for him. All of his followers had told him different ways that they could get him out of the prison. The prison wasn't even guarded well. No one really expected him to go through with it. People thought that he would just go off into exile and escape, but he didn't even try. He very much accepted his sentencing. And in part, there's an argument that, oh, well, he did it as like a kind of sensationalist thing because he got to go out with a boom, which is a little bit of a callous interpretation, I think, though. Even if that's true, it still doesn't discount the point that, he faced death instead of escaping. But I think overall what it is that through facing the consequences of his actions, which was to say that he was not wrong for what he did. He was not going to apologize for the charges that were against him of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the old gods. He did not acknowledge that those were valid crimes that he had committed. And so he stood by his principles. And in doing so, he lived out the full extent of those principles, which was to end his life in a kind of glory as this beloved figure, as opposed to what? Escaping death only to wander the desert as an elderly man, disgraced and exiled, and then die in kind of a fading out.
Yeah, there's different theories about why he did what he did. One being that he was actually he knew he was like 70 or something, and he was like, all right, I'm not going to like move to a different city. There's another explanation I've heard is that he actually wanted to, if the democracy came to the decision, then he wanted to abide by that, but maybe he wanted to abide by that to show that democracies actually make bad decisions all the time. Different ideas about why Socrates did that.
Either way, there's this idea of not escaping consequences, not trying to live your life by avoiding consequences for things, because then that's the principle then becomes escaping consequences, not telling the truth, for example, not compassion or courage. It becomes...
Well, but we all want to escape the consequences of injustice, correct? So in other words, if something has been unjustly done to you, well, if something has been unjustly done to you, and I mean, I'm not sure I'm ready to say that you should just accept the consequences of any injustice that has been done to you based on, I don't know about that part. I think you shouldn't try to escape the consequences of what you've done to yourself, because that's ultimately, you're just going to end up fucking yourself over again some other similar way or even more elaborate way later if you do that. But,
well, the argument
I'm not
is
ready
how
to say
do you
just
escape?
submit to consequences because someone says should.
I'm not saying you should submit. But there was something here where he would have had to say, yes, I apologize for my crimes.
He could have just pieced out.
Or
They said, like, here's the doors open, you can leave.
There's another thing. He could have
Or he
ran.
could have wrought vengeance upon those who tried to subvert. That's my version of Socrates, is he, gathers a
militia.
Well, yeah. Because he was a soldier. He was a soldier, Socrates was. People don't know that a lot of times. He was actually a soldier. So, maybe he should have proclaimed himself a tyrant of Athens. And
that doesn't seem very like Socrates.
It doesn't. I'm just saying I don't think that you necessarily need to drink hemlock to make a point.
I'm not saying.
And I'm not saying you're saying
maybe if you're
that.
Socrates, maybe you do, because I think it makes a great story. And the reason it does is because it's imbued with a principle that he lived by. I think that's why it becomes this asset to his memory, to who he was, as opposed to had he escaped. No one would tell the story of when Socrates escaped his execution. We talk about the execution and being unjust, but there's this entire other element that's added to the story of his life through the choices that he made, because when you make these choices that are very in line with your principles or these ideals, it's like your life becomes the story of those ideals. I see it as, this is why there's, as opposed to just trying to escape negative consequences all the time, which is I'm not going to say this because some people might get mad. Well, what do you want the underlying theme of your life story to be? Here is the story of a life lived by trying to avoid negative consequences. Or here is the story of someone who told the truth when it mattered. Here is the story
that part I'm
of
with
someone,
you on. I think it's great. You should do that. I'm then saying that if you do tell the truth and the powers that be try to come down on you, don't be a sucker. Get to Sparta or get to Thessalonica or Thessalonia, I'm not sure. Go to Corinth. Go wherever you got to go. Maybe, or maybe
Austin today.
I've been to Austin one time. Twice, maybe. I don't know.
It's probably over
It's
already.
no Corinth.
It's no Corinth.
Austin, Texas is no Corinth. So
speak truth or die. Socrates did both. So how about that?
He did. He did.
Can't top that.
I'm not trying to bring Socrates down. I love the trial of Socrates, that story. We should cover it at some point in the library circus thing.
Yeah, we should.
I was just trying to make a distinction between, you know,
yeah,
I don't think you have to accept the punishment.
Didn't Nelson Mandela like get stuck in jail for 1,000 years for what he did? I mean, he could have
It was
like
1,000 years.
fought.
Yes. I don't want to get into that.
jailers?
I don't know specific stuff.
Yeah, I don't know either. But you know, there is a certain like, and Jesus could have been like, fuck this. I'm not getting crucified. I'm not doing this. This isn't right. This is an injustice. There's an idea behind bearing your cross, right? Like, and of course it's not there's nuance to it. I don't think that you should just lay down and die if someone like unjustly tries to punish you for doing the right thing by your standards. But there's a difference between just kind of not defending yourself after the fact, but then trying to avoid any negative outcome. I think that's you're speaking at another level, another plane of existence. Like, how do we now organize after someone has spoken a dangerous truth and is being, come down upon? We're starting over here, which is speak the truth first, which I think people struggle with. Because I think in particular, social media has cultivated this culture that's very collectivist, which is this very village mindset of like, well, I don't want to stir the pot. I don't want to bring the mob upon me, even though it's digital, for the most part, this virtual pitchforks. But I think that people are more averse to speaking out things that they would freely say if they're hanging out with friends and company online, which to a degree that's fine because it's not hanging out with friends when you're online. But there is an element of if you feel moved to say something that you feel is true and important, that's very important to follow through with that and not to decide what you will and won't say based on the consequences of it, because then you end up in this situation where, I think it's not that Neil so the character dies, right? So this is this idea of speak your truth or die. But it's not so much that you die even physically, but the you that could have been, had you spoken the truth, does die. The you that could have come of that choice to do something courageous, to live by your values, to live for what you believe, that person does die when you refuse to give it life by bringing it into existence. So I think that's kind of the lesson in that instance of the movie.
I agree with what you're saying. I do. I'm not going to sully this conversation with discussion of Twitter. I reject it. I'm going to speak my truth and say that I will not. I refuse, despite your persecution, to speak about social media for this episode. There is the necessity to speak the truth beyond the ethical part of it to some degree, in my opinion. And this is what I've always kind of felt about this, that when you lie, you distort reality for other people, which is a kind of assault in a way, because you're actually changing their reality. When you lie and you purposely mislead someone and then you change their worldview, which has consequences for them because they'll act according to the distorted worldview. On top of that, I feel like, for myself anyway, and for others, that we all have a hard enough time as it is trying to figure out what reality is like. When we really start to think about it, obviously, I don't go about my day-to-day, we'll say, challenging reality at every moment. But
not every moment.
But especially if you have a tendency to think a lot or maybe deal with issues, there is a question of, well, what is going on? What is reality like? And so that's what the thing is offensive to me about lying, is that I don't like I'm already trying to deal with trying to figure out what the fuck's going on. That's hard enough. Please don't distort my reality by lying to me about something. You know, if it's accidental, I understand. Because people believe things that aren't true.
Well, that's not really a lie then, per se. That's right? That's a misunderstanding,
yeah, I agree.
Or whatever.
I agree. Sure.
I wouldn't. Yeah, we'll associate what lie with intention, with consciousness for the purposes of this discussion.
Seems fair. So that's kind of the thing about it. Let's maybe put aside the ethics of it, but like when we do that, and even in small ways, when we do that, and what does that mean? So it means that you don't care about trying to figure out what reality is like enough to even stop lying. And then that's a kind of debasement of, I would go so far as to say it's almost a debasement of the value of existence. Well, maybe that's
why religion has long held values against lying. Because if you think that, here for the religious example, argument would be, if God makes reality, then to deny reality, to distort reality, would be to offend God, would be to deny the greatness of what God had made. I'm not religious. I'm not saying that's my perspective, but there is an interesting perspective that can come from viewing reality as something sacred, something that deserves respect, and you disrespect something by lying about it or to it. But I think I resonate a lot with the idea of lying, not just as this kind of immoral thing, but as an error, as a bad tool for navigating life. Because really, if you put the ego out of the way, the problem is a lot of people act from ego, not from a higher desire to understand the world. And lies are a great tool for protecting a fragile understanding of the world that the ego depends upon, which is whatever, I am fine the way I am. It's fine for me to treat people like this, or whatever thing that someone wants to justify that's actually not good for them, but that the acknowledgement and change is something that scares them because it would be uncomfortable or painful even. And so a lie allows for ignoring reality, which is what allows you to entertain whatever fantasy that is keeping you comfortable. Now, of course, that keeps you from being a better version of yourself. But there's just this, essentially there's a curative element to becoming fascinated with reality, which is you find yourself being you find a lot of disdain for lying. And it doesn't come from a moral place. It's not the same as like, oh, lying is bad. It makes you a bad person. It's more that you are not being productive. Like there's a sense of like, you're not trying to figure out reality and you're making it harder for people that are. I find that that's something that I hate so much about politics and ideologues and all of that, because all of it is an ego-driven attempt to distort reality to prop up the weak parts of their worldview. And it's like, just let it fall apart so that you can see what's actually there, instead of trying to obscure the holes in your worldview so that you can keep this rickety thing intact. And that's where you get lying. It's like a plaster to cover over the holes that are popping up in your shitty worldview.
So let's move on to one last point about this, because it's a topic that we'll have to come back to many different times, and but as I always like to do, kind of take different points of view on different subjects. So
why to lie?
There is, what's that?
Why to lie? You're gonna argue?
No,
for
not
lying.
that. But so there's a common like, okay, how should I put this? One of the people that speaks very loudly, one of the students in this film, is what is he? He's the guy with the saxophone in the cave.
Yeah.
He's kind of, okay, that guy. And he does this kind of thing where he disrupts the assembly and mocks the principal by having a fake phone or saying somebody called and this or that, right? And this is before even the tragedy of his friend dying, I believe, right?
It is.
Okay. So he's kind of, and he's even remonstrated by whatever,
Keating.
Robin Williams.
The
Keating,
teacher,
thank you. Yeah. So the analogy I see potentially is something like this. Like, let's say that I'm going to put this on me so I don't harm anyone else.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to think how I can do it. So let's say, what should I do? Let's say that I, before the podcast, accidentally had cut off half of my mustache or something. And I looked just like a fucking silly clown. I came on here looking like a silly clown, right? And you, before we began recording, decided not to tell me that because you didn't want to hurt my feelings, right? Now, this is a common ethical conundrum many people have, you know. So some people are going to not tell me that because they just wouldn't want the uncomfortableness of that. Some people would. And so there are people who try to justify lying by saying, well, I don't want to hurt that person's feelings. Do we think that, and the opposite of that is a way in which I have tended to comport myself in life, which has not always been to my advantage, which is to be perhaps a little bit
overly eager.
You know,
to offer truths before they are
to offer truths at times unsolicited, you know, but for the most part
truth.
But for the most part solicited, and for the most part amongst people that I, you know, have a relationship of some sort with.
Yeah.
But you know, we all know these people, and yes, I am to some degree one of those people, which I think you can speak to from experience, is that I am very like. I will tell you, if you go on the podcast and you have accidentally shaved off half of your mustache, I would tell you beforehand. I would say, what are you doing, you silly clown?
Yeah.
Right.
That's what you would say.
And so the analogy with this kid is that he spoke up very brashly. It's not a very good analogy, actually. I was just trying to bring this in a little bit. But then, you know, there are people, and I'm not going to say that I am one of these people. There are people, though, who enjoy telling the truth, but in a vindictive way and in a kind of a mean way. Like they don't have a whole lot of finesse in telling the truth, and they get a kick out of it too, you know.
Yeah.
And that
comes
kid,
down to intention.
But they're still telling the truth, and then a wider question becomes: is there value to the truth and someone telling the truth, even if the reason they're doing it is because they derive a kind of pleasure? Like, okay, let me put it this way. Is it best to tell the truth, even if part of the reason you're doing that is because it gives you pleasure to annoy people? But it's still the truth.
Well,
and is there a place in society for people like that? I think there is. Like that, it's the Socrates gadfly type person. It's
usually it's a comic. That's a comedian.
Right. Good point.
That actually does that. And then it's not so much unsolicited because it has its own arena, right? Which is, it's comedy. So if you want to hear blunt truth, you go to see a comedy show. Now, of course, there are a lot of people that don't like to hear blunt truths or inconvenient truths or unsolicited truths, but they don't have to go to those comedy shows or watch the show or whatever it is. So I think that's one example of the kind of truths that maybe we ignore in social settings because they may do more harm than good. I think there's a kind of cost-benefit analysis that must be done, and that if you tip your cost-benefit analysis for telling the truth in the direction of telling the truth solely for personal pleasure, then the outcome is likely to be perverted by that intention.
Not necessarily though, because if I had mistakenly cut off half my mustache, right, before doing the podcast,
yeah, but if I was like, oh,
but you would love it,
you
would love it. But let's separate that for a second, because if you then told me, even in a non-gentle way, and you derived much mirth from this, if I then fixed it, we could say that it actually still, regardless of your intention, it was helpful.
Okay, but let's use a less ridiculous example, which is you have on, you got a haircut that you quite like, but it's not so great on you. And you come on the podcast and you're like, I just got this new haircut. I love it. I feel so great. Like I love, you would never do this.
Would I ever speak in that way?
You never. I don't think you don't even cut your hair. So this example is already in the land of fantasy, but let's remain there. So if you're just, you feel you're enjoying this haircut you've got, but
Should we play act it out real quick for the audience?
Let's do that.
Okay, let's do that.
Let's do some role playing for the audience.
I think that would be useful.
Cut your hair on camera live.
No, I'm not going to do that. So, hey, let me try to do this.
Oh boy.
I just got a new haircut from a hair technician. I am extraordinarily excited about it because it makes me appear comely.
Hey, Mark Zuckerberg, I'm seeing that you're having a lot of emotions about your haircut. I'm glad you enjoy it so much. Would you like my thoughts on it?
I do not require them.
Great. I think that you're enjoying your haircut so much, and it makes me happy to see that. Let's start the podcast.
So you would you would just deflect. You would just
if it was real life and it was you and you came with a stupid haircut, I'd tell you look like an idiot, and you'd say I love it anyway, and then we'd go on. But that's the kind of relationship that we have. So also this truth telling is important. It's based on the relationship, right? Because I wouldn't go up to a stranger and say, you look fat as fuck in that dress. I wouldn't do that because I have no relationship with that person.
Okay, good
and you
point.
need a kind of relationship for the level of truth you're going to tell. And there's also, again, there's a reason I asked in that role-playing instance, do you want to know what I think? Because I think that
the answer is always no. So
that's
briefly,
why I just tell you anyway.
But I think you hit upon this, and I was because this has been a debate in some circles in the podcasting world of the health benefits of not being morbidly obese, right? And so this is kind of why I was coming around to this is like, there's not a real nice way to tell somebody that they're overweight that I know of. So I've never learned how to do it. And we can all
plump.
We can all agree. We can all agree that within the circle of people that are relatively close to you, maybe you can have a conversation like that, and that it's maybe more appropriate. That's what you just said. Now, but here's a problem. What if, and I think that to some degree it can be stated fairly simply, that it isn't healthy. Your health outcomes are more likely to be negative if you're morbidly obese or not, and that's the case for strangers. Now, I admit that I shouldn't go out into the streets and yell at fat people. Something about that's wrong, right? And we're trying to think this out, but
something about it is wrong, yeah.
What if it's really bad for them to be morbidly obese, right? Mm-hmm. Should I run out to the streets and tell them they're fat? Because then I would be,
but they know
even if
fat.
I were gleefully doing it, I was like, I love telling people they're fat, and it was bad. I was a bad person for doing it because I just like to do it. But then if they took that seriously, I guess one of the problems would be they wouldn't take it seriously because it's so outside of the norms of how people interact with one another, they would immediately become defensive. Mm-hmm. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Do we have a responsibility to tell the truth even when it hurts people's feelings? And of course, with the caveat that we all don't know the final and absolute truth in most situations anyway.
Yeah. I mean,
do you have a responsibility?
Well, again, I think it's very contextual, based on context. I don't think it's my place to go up to strangers and tell them the truth because I don't know whether they even know that truth. There could be a fat person, but they're trying really hard to work out and they're already, you know, working on that. They already know. They just haven't succeeded yet. They haven't, whatever, they just started. So I think there's a context that is required for telling the truth, which is why it's such a nuanced and complicated thing, because it's mitigated by so many different factors, like the intention. You know, I do think that kind of telling the truth in an almost malicious way I think it perverts the outcome, because I think that if you place too much of your intention for telling the truth comes from something malicious, I think it perverts the lens through which you view the situation that requires telling truth. So you may assess a situation as, well, here's the truth, but is this a truth that needs to be told? And will you telling it actually warrant the outcome that truth should cause, right? So the idea is like, if I go up to a fat person, I tell them, hey, it's really unhealthy to be fat. So you know this. I want you to know this. It's
so
important.
You know, and then just walk away. Yeah, of course. I'm not suggesting anyone do that, by the way. What is interesting.
That people understand that, yeah.
I bet people have done that. What is interesting, though, and God help me, I'm going to do it to myself. I'm going to go to social media for a moment. You know, you wouldn't ever do that, actually. You're right. In person, go up to a stranger and tell them that, even in a nice way. It just wouldn't be done. But people will do that on social media.
Yeah, but they're not doing it because they're like, I want to tell them the truth.
No, I actually think that there probably are. So I mean,
well, maybe
look,
some.
is
Yeah,
this one of
there's
the
some.
simple? Yeah, like this has been a theme during the pandemic on the Joe Rogan podcast. Let's just explicitly say this is kind of where this came from. Is he very often says, look, your health outcomes are worse if you're morbidly obese. He says that in a public forum, not directly to human beings in front of him, but out there, let's call it in the social media space, because those messages go out there. I don't believe he's doing that in a malicious or mean way at all. I think he genuinely wants to help people.
That's stating a truth, but it's not at anyone in particular. There's a difference there because it's a diffusion of the target of the truth.
But every fat person who hears that takes it, I would assume, understands that it is not directed to Mr. John Fatman, but it's directed to...
But it's also not directed specifically at them. There's a kind of affront that comes with directly telling someone a truth that is specific towards them, because they have to respond. You know, there's something so, how can I say, so personalized about directing a truth specific. That truth may be true for everyone. It's true for everyone, regardless of whether you're fat or skinny, that being obese is not good for you. That's just a fact. But it doesn't require any one individual to respond to that fact. Now, they may respond to it, but it wasn't directed at them. And I think that's why, in a way, that there's something so nice about that, because even when I write, you know, my newsletter, I'll write about contemporary issues and things that I see that are going on that may involve specific people, but I never name them, because I don't think it's useful, because it ends up becoming contentious, you know? And there's something about taking that step back and making it generalized enough that then it becomes diffused enough that everybody can gain some kind of value from that if they so desire it, without it being directed at one person that now must, you know,
must respond or feel like they must respond. I think that's right, actually. I think that's right. Because then it allows the people to which this thing is directed to in general, if they're ready and they feel okay enough to deal with that at the moment, then they can, and maybe they can, you know, change whatever it is. But then those who aren't, and some people, like, because, you know, there are people who may be in a situation where the truth could help them, but compounded upon one problem they have is another problem they're already dealing with. It's even worse, or like that they have to prioritize at that moment. And so there is an aspect of that where it's like, you shouldn't just beat up people that are already kind of dealing with not only one problem with another problem. And I think everyone instinctively knows that. And I don't think anyone actually does that besides complete, but people that are, I don't ever, and I have a few friends that are but you're right. Also, there's the relationship aspect of it. Cause like I have friends that I can talk to and part of that relationship is that we're going to be obnoxiously, brutally truthful for the most part.
There's it to be, lame about it. There's an element of consent. Like it actually has this element of, do you consent to this level of truth telling? Are you comfortable with this?
Well, I'm not comfortable with your use of the word lame.
Oh. I thought you were going to say consent.
No. Meeks, come over here. Come over to the window, Meeks. Let's have a consensual conversation.
For an animal. Let's
have a consensual conversation.
That should be the name of the podcast. Consensual conversation.
No, I understand. Yeah, I think it. So.
Yeah, great. We've parsed out basic social behavior for people. That's why they tune in, to know not to walk up to random fat people in the world and say, "You're extremely fat, it's bad for you," and then just walk away.
There are many out there like myself who are not
podcasts for aliens that are trying to figure out how to be a human.
Yeah, well, there's many of us out there. All right, it's not a small audience, and as an audience is growing more and more by the day, people that don't understand the intricacies always of how to interact with others.
When do I tell people that they're fat? When exactly is the right time?
I know that you don't do that.
This better be a patron episode, because
I'm trying to bring this.
I feel like fat is a slur now. Like you can't even say that word. We've said it so many times. You watch, the algorithm's gonna take us down. One of us has got to get fat so it's not offensive.
Well, it's not me. And,
it ain't gonna be me.
So there you go. I mean, that pretty much says it. And
Meeks,
I don't know.
Come over here and have a snack.
Do what?
Just have a snack. We need to have like a, how do you call
I give you permission that if I grow fat during this podcast,
if I grow,
you are allowed to publicly shame me.
On the podcast, yeah.
Yeah, publicly shame me. I give you permission. I give consent to my public shaming if I grow obese on the podcast.
And if I do that for my have half a mustache, public shaming.
I really, yeah. And because
we're fans of public shaming here is the thing. It's a certain
public shaming, child soldiers,
consensual child soldiers, consensual public shame. Don't shame people against their will. That's kind of shitty, but like, I like to shame.
I don't know. I'm still a little. I guess you haven't actually taught me. You haven't actually convinced me, because I'm not sure that's always true. Though. Well, I have a long time.
It's the same principle as with telling the truth, that there's a lot of nuance. Now, what if you're a person with a large following and you pick up some random, child, some 14-year-old that made a Twitter that's stupid and said something kid offensive, and you're like, I'm going to ruin your life. Like, you don't know who's saying things. So public shaming, Now then again, there are some people that consent to be in the public arena through their work. It is public work. And that's what they're doing. I think I consent to be public shamed by creating things publicly. I don't want it, but it's kind of part of the deal. I think it's still a shitty thing to do for like stupid reasons. If someone's really out here, like if I'm like, I'm going to murder my co-host on the podcast live and someone wants to shame us for that. If it's not consensual.
Clipped, archived, kept for the future.
I think this episode is going to get pulled to ice. Accused. I just stated a plan, a threat.
Of course. I'm talking about, but what about like really people that most people can agree are, I'm not talking about if you're overweight. I'm talking about like criminals and people that have done heinous, well, then they're kind of dealt with the justice system. But
exactly.
There are mob shameful
justice, because the shame campaigns are kind of mob justice, though. Right?
I don't believe in mob
they could
shame.
Be wrong.
I don't believe in mob shame. I agree. I believe in individual.
Okay.
I believe that. I believe that you as my business associate and friend that I have not only a right, but a obligation to you to shame you if necessary. No?
Publicly?
I would think that one would want to do that privately first.
Yeah. That might be the best sequence.
Let's abstract this for a second and then end this. What about a person who litters? I don't like people that litter. You
Yeah, I
know,
don't
like
like it
you see
either.
somebody, they throw the wrapper on the ground, all right?
Well,
Now,
I have a real world example. I
Okay.
recently was in a parking lot and I was parked sitting in my car getting ready to leave. And then there was a car next to me, a space in between us, and they rolled down the window and threw a wrapper on the floor. And I sat there for a good several minutes debating the ethical outcome. Do you know what I chose?
No.
I chose to do nothing. Because I
figured.
didn't want to get shot, first of all, over a wrapper on the floor. I
Sure.
thought of several different things. I thought, well, I could be like, hey, what the hell? That was immediately discounted because that's how you get shot. Then I thought I could pretend that they made a mistake and say, hey, your wrapper fell out of the car. But they would probably just be like, shut up. Then I thought I could go and actually pick up the wrapper and be like, I'll throw it away for you, and just walk away and throw it away. And then I thought, that's a little sociopathic.
No, that's actually that's actually the art of shame. That's the correct one, because you don't interact with the person, so you're not being hardcore against them, but then you give them the mirror of shame to look into if they're capable of doing it. You deal with their thing.
I
You
decided not to do anything, though.
You could even do a that's what I would do.
Oh, God. You're going to get
I would
shot.
I would go
This is
pick
why
up
you
the
don't leave your
wrapper
house.
and then turn to them and go
That's horrible.
that's what I no? You don't think
That's
so?
true psychopathy. Like, that's it's a little concerning. I decided to do nothing because they
That's a
looked like
tut-tut-tut.
legitimate criminals. So I was like, this is not how I'm going to end up with my face in the newspaper on the obituary. She wanted to pick up a wrapper. God bless her. Rest in peace.
Well, you've lived a lie, and now the National Parks Department is soiled.
Well, it wasn't the national parks. It was a parking lot in some crappy neighborhood. So it's like, hey, buddy, I don't live here. That's in your neighborhood. So enjoy. Keep your neighborhood clean. Don't go around cleaning up other people's neighborhoods. You know, it's Jordan Peterson of neighborhood activism. Clean your own neighborhood.
Regardless, I think that we've really done a lot of social good in this episode.
I apologize. I want to apologize to our listeners.
Don't
For this
apologize.
episode.
Stop with the apologies. Everyone's tired of the
I
apologies.
would never apologize. It's a joke. Every apology that comes from me is a joke.